cool. Well, hey, you guys can see that I'm doing my presentation on the effects of ocean warming and acidification on coral reefs. As you guys kind of know, I'm a big water dork, and I especially love everything about the ocean, so this is my way of shining a small light on what's happening there. As we go through the presentation, we'll do a small review of anthropogenic climate change and how that's affecting the ocean and how those effects are impacting coral reefs and what's going to be done about it, or what is being done about it. But let's get started with why we even have ocean warming and acidification happening. That is due to anthropogenic climate change. This slide should be a review for most of us since we've gone over it recently, but in case you have forgotten, we live on the Earth and it has a happy and comfy climate, and that is due to something called the greenhouse effect, which is defined as the heating of the Earth's atmosphere that results from the absorption of infrared radiation from Earth's surface by components in the ozone layer. Unfortunately, due to things that we are doing like deforestation and the burning of fossil fuels, we are adding to the gases in the atmosphere, gases like methane and nitrous oxide, and especially carbon dioxide. All of those extra gases are trapping in more energy and just enhancing the greenhouse effect, which is causing the Earth to warm up, and that heat is being distributed around the globe through convection cells that drive our weather patterns. All of that extra heat around the globe is increasing evaporation, causing more water vapor to be in the atmosphere. And unfortunately, water vapor is the single most important absorber of heat and contributes 36 to 66% towards the greenhouse effect, which means it's just trapping even more heat, which is causing even more evaporation, which means it's creating a positive feedback loop, which is just reinforcing the heating of the Earth. Now, what does that mean for the oceans? Well, it means that they're warming because the heat does not stay in the atmosphere. Now the ocean itself has a very unique property in its high heat capacity, which means its ability to take in a lot of that heat without having the temperature change very much, which has worked very well in the past, but unfortunately that's beginning to change as the oceans have absorbed 93% of the heat from the atmosphere. This has caused the average surface temperature to rise 0.6 degrees Celsius or 1.1 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. Now, the International Panel of Climate Change that released a report in 2016 did a study of ocean temperatures at every depth and saw an increase at every single depth, with the greatest increases occurring at the poles and the tropics. Now, the ocean isn't just dealing with warming, it's also dealing with changes in its pH and its acidification. Normally, the ocean has a pretty decent system as far as being able to handle carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, oceans have absorbed a quarter of the CO2 that is in the air, so it's starting to change that. Naturally, the ocean, as you can see in the graphic, in my shot, it is in the left-hand corner. I don't know what it is in your guys's, but it's the one that shows the chemistry that is happening in the ocean. I won't go completely through it since this isn't a chemistry class, and that would be extremely boring, but it basically shows how carbon dioxide absorbs into the ocean and how the chemistry works, where it releases hydrogen ions, and how eventually those hydrogen ions will eventually be taken up by the calcium carbonate down there at the bottom where it says coral. This is how the ocean is able to maintain its balance, but due to the increase in its carbon dioxide levels, that natural buffering system, or the antacid for the ocean, is being overwhelmed. The ocean temperatures have a naturally slightly alkaline pH of an average of 8.1, but that has decreased by 0.1 since pre-industrial ages. And if you look at the graphic on the right, with the graph, with the increase in dissolved carbon dioxide that is likely going to happen, the pH will will keep decreasing as time goes on. Now, what does all that mean for coral reefs? Well, first we have to know what coral reefs are. And an interesting thing that I learned while I was doing this research for this presentation is there are actually two types of coral reefs. I only never knew about the one, which was the warm water type, but there's actually a cold water type too. But most of the research that I read covers the warm water type. So that's what this presentation is going to be about, the warm water, and my subsequent paper will be about that too. But coral reefs are colonies of individual polyps that are closely related to jellies, if you can believe that. They build a hard calcium carbonate structure for protection, and on their own are actually able to capture 10% of the food that they need through stinging jellies, or stinging tentacles, just like jellies. Because of that, that's obviously not enough to sustain them, so they have evolved to have a symbiotic relationship with photosynthetic algae, with the most common type being the zooxanthellae, at least in the research that I've read. Now, coral reefs, at least the warm water type, do require warm water. They're very temperature sensitive, and they require waters of 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, and those waters normally found along the equator, or 35 degrees north and south of the equator as well. Besides warm waters, the coral reefs also require strong sunlight and a lack of turbidity, which is for their photosynthetic algae to get their food. They also require strong wave and current action to bring in nutrients. They require salt water, as they will die in fresh water, and they also require a hard substrate to build their calcium carbonate structures on. Now, as mentioned earlier, stuff is happening in the ocean, stuff that is impacting coral reefs. First off, with the warming that is happening in the ocean, it's causing bad things to happen to coral reefs. As I mentioned earlier, they are extremely sensitive to temperature changes, either too cold or too hot, and that is due to the high heat capacity of the ocean. They just haven't evolved to be able to handle that. So even small temperature changes of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer, since that seems to be the trend that is happening in the ocean, can cause a buildup of reactive oxygen in coral tissue, which becomes toxic, causing them to expel their normally beneficial photosynthetic algae. And as you can see in the picture, if you look at the top, you can see the two different types of corals, the brown polyps and the red beneficial algae. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the healthy algae with its color and, the photosynthetic algae. In the right, you can see the bleaching that has occurred when they expelled their algae. And unfortunately, if temperatures do not return to normal and they do not take back their algae, they basically will starve and die. Now, small bleaching events have been reported for the past 100 years, but large-scale bleaching that we see nowadays, like that has happened in the Great Barrier Reef, was never seen before 1979, with the biggest and worst case happening in 2016. Now, besides ocean warming, we also talked about ocean acidification, which is occurring and has caused the ocean pH to decrease by 0.1, which doesn't sound like a lot, but of course, we all know that it is. It's actually a 26% increase in hydrogen ions in the ocean, and without some readily available calcium carbonate to take up those hydrogen ions, it will eat away at the skeleton structure of the coral reefs themselves. And without any other extra calcium carbonate, it will also eat away at all the excess that they're trying to build and repair themselves, leaving them weak and exposing them to disease that can kill them further. Now, when we lose these polyps and their beneficial algae, we're just not losing the hard substrate of the coral reefs themselves. We're also losing an ecosystem, as coral reefs are home to at least 25% of the known marine species, which is a great big deal, and that's only the ones that we know about. A meta-analysis of 17 independent studies revealed that fish that rely on live coral cover for food and shelter decrease in abundance within 3 years of an event such as bleaching, which would be kind of the equivalent of us losing a big portion of the Amazon rainforest, which is a pretty big deal. Now, what does that mean for the future of corals and coral reefs? Well, they have a couple of options. They can adapt, acclimate, or relocate, and some studies are showing that they're starting to do these things. In the form of adaptation, some coral reefs are shifting their symbiotic relationship to a more heat-tolerant algae. Unfortunately, this is not an equal swap and has been shown to keep them alive, but have a slower growth rate, which leaves them open to competition to other marine benthic species that grow faster, like kelp. Some other adaptations that scientists are seeing are that they're becoming more heterotrophic, which means they wouldn't need their beneficial algae at all. Studies saw an increase in ocean waters to 30 degrees Celsius was enough to increase heterotrophic feeding in some Hawaiian coral reef species. So a lot of these things are dependent on the species. And for some species who aren't adapting, they're able to acclimate to these warmer temperatures by surviving these extreme heating events, which means they are able to pass on that heat-tolerant gene to the next generation. Unfortunately for coral, their next generation can happen anywhere between 5 to 100 years as far as when they release their spores, which is definitely too long. So that is where humans are stepping in to help. Some scientists are going in and collecting the larvae from these heat-tolerant species, or these coral reefs that survive these extreme heat events, and using a prototype robot like you see in the left-hand corner here to help seed bleached corals, and then they can monitor the growth rate of them and the water conditions to ensure their survival. Other scientists are going into these areas where coral reefs are surviving and taking small bits off of them, and they're able to regrow them in nurseries of such to be able to replant them in devastated areas to help bring back a coral reef population. For ones that aren't adapting or acclimating, they will have an opportunity to relocate, because as the water is warm, it expands out of the normal territory in which they grow above or below the 35-degree latitude area. Fossil records of past climate change events have indicated that this is what has happened to coral reefs in the past. Unfortunately, during those climate change events, they happened over a long period of time and were kind of gradual. The heating that we're seeing today in the Earth's oceans is happening faster than has ever been recorded in the past. Now, what does all of that mean for us? Now, that's a lot of information, and it all sucks for coral reefs, but it really comes down to how that impacts humans, because if humans don't care, they're not going to do anything. I can tell you have a very big impact on the human population, especially the ones that are around it and depend on it for things like food and life, income and all that. To put that in perspective for you, according to the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, which is a part of NOAA, the Southeast Florida Coral Reef estimates for the asset value of the coral reefs there is $8.5 billion, which is able to generate $4.4 billion in local sales. That is $2 billion towards the local economy and income, and it creates over $70,000 full-time and part-time jobs. And the annual commercial value of U.S. fisheries alone from coral reefs is over $100 million annually. Now, that is just Florida itself, which coral reefs span along the entire world along the equator and impacts people all along the way, with the biggest coral reef being the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So if we were to lose coral reefs, we're losing a lot as far as food and income and people's livelihoods, and that'll happen all around the world. And when you think about it, when you hear all those things, those are some pretty big numbers, and they seem kind of obvious for the fact that when you think about going to the beach, you think about going snorkeling, at least I do, and all the cool tropical fish that go along with it. But the coral reefs have a lot more to offer besides just the obvious things that we have or that we've seen and I just talked about. They grow along our shorelines and are able to be a natural barrier to storm surges, and they also help slow the erosion along the shorelines where they grow. So these are important factors that you don't really think about until they're gone. And given the fact that storms, more extreme storms and weather patterns are becoming the new normal, this is a very important resource that requires our attention, and especially for us to be able to protect it. I guess that's it. That's my presentation, and here are my sources cited.